Hey guys, I'm Hannah Cox with BASEDPolitics, and you're watching my show, Hannah Explains It All, where every week I help you understand the political and economic and legal and societal issues that are happening all around you. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave me a like and a comment, and check out other videos in my series. Over the past week, it was recently announced that the conviction of Harvey Weinstein has been overturned. Now, this announcement shocked the general public, but for most people in the legal community, they seemed to think it was going to happen all along. If you recall, Harvey Weinstein is the notorious Hollywood producer who was accused by countless numbers of women during the Me Too movement of using his position to solicit sexual favors from them in exchange for roles in his film, and was often quite threatening and even blackmailed them if they wouldn't comply. Now, while he was accused by literally, I'm pretty sure, hundreds of women, there were only a small handful of those that were actually able to press charges against him, given the time frame in which they brought about these complaints, and I think just the choices of prosecutors in general. Let's roll this quick video from CBS to remind everybody about the various details of the trial and discuss exactly how and why it got overturned.
Breaking news. Disgraced Hollywood movie producer Harvey Weinstein, who's been in prison since 2020 when he was convicted of sexual assault here in New York in one of the big criminal cases that highlighted the Me Too movement. Well, this morning, the state's highest court has ordered a new trial for Weinstein. What does that mean? CBS News legal analyst Ricky Kleeman joins us now. Ricky, I feel blindsided by this. I think a lot of people do. Talk to me about the ruling, the merits of it, and what it means.
The ruling says that there were egregious, that's the word, egregious errors made by the trial judge in this case. It seems that the primary reason that this case has been overturned has to do with the judge allowing other women who were not part of the charges in this case, that they were allowed to testify to what we lawyers call prior bad acts, that is, acts they said were sexual assault done by Harvey Weinstein. What the highest court of New York says is that that evidence was so unduly prejudicial that its admission changed the course of the trial because the jury was looking at Harvey Weinstein, looking at his character, this propensity to act, and not looking at the crimes that were charged in New York.
It sounds like you are not all that surprised as a legal expert seeing how the case unfolded that we're here today.
Yes, that is correct. I was not surprised as a lawyer, but I am sure society is surprised. Keep in mind this, he still is doing 16 years for convictions for similar crimes in California.
So it remains to be seen if he's free in New York or going to be held because he's serving this concurrent sentence. Ricky Kleeman, thank you very much. We're still processing this. Appreciate it. And we should say that the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, talking about processing this, has come out with a statement just moments ago saying, quote, "We will do everything in our power to retry this case and remain steadfast in our commitment to survivors of sexual assault."
Now, just to be clear, Harvey Weinstein is not a free man at the moment, despite the fact that his New York conviction was thrown out, and that's because he was also tried and convicted in California for similar charges. Now, it's not clear whether or not that conviction will be upheld as well. It is a separate case, but his attorneys are planning to try the same course of action that was successful for them in New York. And many experts think they could be successful. So if the California conviction goes down in a similar fashion, then he could walk free. This would not be unprecedented. We saw something similar happen with Bill Cosby a number of years ago in his similar case as well. It also was unclear when this first went down whether or not the prosecutors in New York would decide to retry the case. It's pretty rare that a conviction gets overturned and just tossed out carte blanche like this one. Typically only happens for pretty wealthy people in my experience. And when it does, you'll often see prosecutors choose not to try the case again, and that's because it's pretty hard to try a case, especially one like this. Sexual crimes have statutes of limitations because the evidence to prove them is just not that good after a certain amount of time has expired. Oftentimes, witnesses are very uncooperative. They certainly don't want to have to go and present their story numerous times for various juries. And as a whole, the criminal justice system just really isn't in the business of conducting trials, period. So when one gets overturned and thrown out, the likelihood that the prosecutors try to bring it again is kind of up in the air. But it appears that the prosecutors will be retrying this case in New York, which is going to be interesting because the way they were able to get the conviction to begin with was quite shaky. The idea that they would be able to get it a second time seems pretty unlikely to me, which means probably taxpayers will spend a lot of money for what ultimately comes down to a virtue signaling trial. But the real reason I want to discuss this particular case and its outcome today is because I have what I think is a controversial stance on it, which is that I actually support the decision for the court to overturn this case. As you can tell from my title of this episode, I think that this was a shoddy conviction and I don't think it should be upheld. Now, I want to be so crystal clear before anybody in like the red pill, manosphere, anti-women atmosphere online thinks I'm like on your side on these issues in general. I'm not. I am pro-woman. I think the vast majority of women who bring allegations of sexual assault and rape are not lying, and there's data to back me up on that. I like women. I think that we need to do a lot more to address sexual crimes in this country. But I also am a stringent individualist. I believe in the Constitution. I think that the Bill of Rights is imperative to have a free and just society. And many of those amendments in the Bill of Rights pertain to criminal trials for good reason. The government and the criminal justice system, which is its operative, is the largest threat to individual liberty in existence. For those who don't know, I spent about 5 years of my life dedicated to criminal justice reform, public policy work in this country. I passed a number of bills, including overturning the death penalty in 3 different states. And I was not somebody who was ever like soft on crime. If anything, when I first started working around the political movement, I was like one of those people who watched Law & Order SVU religiously. I loved Elliot Stabler. I wrote a whole piece in the Washington Examiner a number of years ago talking about how I actually regret my crush on Elliot Stabler I had in high school, but it was there. And I think when I was first getting around these issues, I, like many Americans, thought that those shows were actually representative of what happened in the criminal justice system. I had this very discongruent ideology where I believed in a limited government because I know that the government will always become corrupt, that it hurts people. I believed in individual liberty because I think it is essential to have a free society, and that government getting in the way of individuals and their version of the American dream is an actual existential threat to their well-being. But I believed those things while also believing that the criminal justice system, which is operated by the government, was accurate and fair and impartial. And most importantly, I believed it got it right most of the time. So when I started working around mental health as a volunteer around 2014, I was really surprised to find the immense amount of overlap between the mental health community and the criminal justice population. And I quickly became aware that pretty much everything I thought about the criminal justice system was dead ass wrong. I could go on for literally hours on end about all of the problems in our criminal justice system because it is so big and there are so many various issues within it. If you're interested in more of my views on that, you can watch my series Propaganda. I have videos on prosecutors. I have videos on policing. I have videos on the Second Amendment. I have videos across the board that deal with many of these issues that I have with the system. But today, I want to talk specifically about the issues I have with the system when it comes to sexual crimes. Working in criminal justice reform often gives people the perspective that you are soft on crime, that you don't care about locking up violent offenders, that you're anti-police or anti the system entirely. And for me, that's simply not true. That is true for some people who work in criminal justice reform, but definitely not all of them. And there's been a very large coalition of people on the right that have been advancing these issues for over a decade now. It's very possible to look at the criminal justice system and believe, as I do, that it needs to ensure people's personhood and property are protected, that it needs to deal with actual crimes swiftly and surely, and that you cannot have a free system, especially a free market, without a court system and therefore a prison system that upholds people who violate the contracts in society that we have made. But while I believe that firmly with this hand, I also firmly believe with this hand that we should have a system that only prosecutes actual crimes with actual victims. I don't think you should be incarcerated for crimes that shouldn't be crimes, that have no victim, and that are nonviolent. I also think that it is so imperative that we uphold the Constitution. It was put in place by our founders because they recognize that the government will always have a lot more money than you, a lot more sway than you, a lot more power than you, and that if we're going to give it the permission to take away your freedom, we need to make it hard. We need to actually give the defendant a fighting chance because sometimes they get it wrong. Sometimes people are innocent. I believe, as the famous quote by William Blackstone goes, that it is better to let 100 guilty men go free than one innocent person perish. And that is why police should actually have to have enough proof, evidence, to even get a warrant to search you. That is why you are entitled to actual due process. That's why you are supposed to get a trial in front of your peers. That's why you have the right to examine the evidence brought against you, the right to testify in your own defense. Many of those fundamental rights are being circumvented as we speak and have even gone out the window in this country, which I'll get to later in this episode. And when that happens and people are not getting actual due process, not getting fair trials, or not even getting trials at all most of the time, what you end up with is a lot of wrongful convictions.
The defense is wrong.
What you end up with is a lot of people who are incarcerated who should not be. And once somebody is wrongfully convicted, it is very, very tough to get them out. I don't want anybody to be fooled by what's happening with Harvey Weinstein into thinking that that is the status quo. It's not. He has a lot of money. He can hire very high-end attorneys who can be dedicated to this effort. He also has the media at his disposal. He has a lot of power, and that is still on display in this case, even as he is a defendant, even as his reputation has been smeared. That power is still there. And the vast majority of people in the prison system do not have it, do not even have actual representation. They're often given an appointed attorney from the state who's juggling like 200 cases at a given time. And even when there is stringent evidence that they were wrongfully convicted, they cannot get a new trial. They can't even get into the appeals process and even present that evidence. This is not how it normally shakes out. But if we cheer taking away the protections that are helping Harvey Weinstein right now, it's going to impact all of those people tenfold. Those protections are essential for every single American. The way the system works for rich people should be how it works for everyone. My other big issue with the criminal justice system is not just that it locks up people who have no business being locked up. It's not just that it wrongfully convicts people. It's that it does these things while simultaneously letting the vast majority of actual violent offenders off. And never is that more evident than when you look at the data around sex crimes. As I said, I believe with this hand that if you commit a violent offense, if you actually harm somebody, that you should be dealt with swiftly and surely. And I do think you should go to jail for a period of time. But the harsh reality is that the vast majority of people who commit sexual crimes will have no such fate. And that is because police are disincentivized from spending their time actually solving hard, difficult, messy crimes. It's a whole lot easier and safer for them, I might add, to chase down some guy selling pot on the corner than it is to investigate powerful people who are doing things wrong. It is shocking the number of these crimes that even get reported, much less investigated, much less prosecuted. Let's go through the numbers. I got these from RAINN, which is an excellent foundation that supports rape victims. You're free to check out their website if you want more information on them. But they report that every 68 seconds, an American is sexually assaulted. They go on to note that 1 out of every 6 American women has been the victim of an attempted or completed rape in her lifetime. They also note that about 3% of American men, or 1 out of every 33, have experienced an attempted or completed rape in their lifetime. They also note that from 2009 to 2013, CPS agencies substantiated or found strong evidence to indicate that 63,000 children a year were victims of this kind of abuse. This is a crime that is happening en masse. Now, these are shocking numbers, I think, when you look at them and recognize just how many Americans have been impacted by these crimes. But what's most shocking of all is that this in no way captures the actual data, because most people never report. Most sexual assault statistics are based on what has been reported to law enforcement. Many statistics are thought to be low because only 30% of sexual assaults ever report to police. And I think in large part that's because when they do, nothing happens. So they go through the trauma of having to go talk to police, have their bodies searched, and then nothing coming as a result of that. According to the FBI, only about 37.8% of rape offenses are cleared each year. And by cleared, it's a legal term you need to know. That doesn't mean that they have had a conviction. That doesn't mean that person's in jail. It doesn't mean there's been a trial. It doesn't even mean they have filed charges. Cleared is a statistic law enforcement uses to say they think they know who did it and to be able to clear it off their books. So when they say most rape victims don't report, it's really not hard to see why. Why would they? Why would they put themselves through this knowing they would get no justice, no accountability? Not only do women go through this experience of trying to report and not getting any traction, they often are then smeared when they try to say what's happened to them, detracted, and even derided, called whores, say that they're gold diggers, they're just looking for money. This is a talking point that you will often hear, especially in the manosphere. I think it's disgusting, and there is nothing to back it up. Every piece of statistical evidence we have shows that it is very, very unlikely for a woman to falsely report these kinds of assaults. And it's pretty obvious why it's very unlikely, because you don't tend to benefit anything. You can't even get charges filed. You can't even get a fair trial. And most of the time, by the way, when women are bringing these accusations, it's not even against like rich and powerful people that can pay them off. A judge in the New York State Supreme Court has said false rape charges are not frequently made. Only about 2% of all rape and related sex charges are determined to be false, the same as other felonies. FBI statistics support this as well. And that's basically the same rate of false reporting as we would see on other crimes. And yet it's only when it comes to this issue that all of a sudden victims are not trustworthy, victims can't be believed. It's a very convenient time for men to be invoking that particular talking point, I think. But with all that being said, some people do lie, right? That is still a reality. And so this is why you have to have actual constitutional protections for the defendant. This is why the state must be forced to actually prove their conviction in order for it to be sound. And again, most people who are going through the criminal justice system are not Harvey Weinstein. They often have a court-appointed attorney. Nothing is stacked in their favor. They need every bit of constitutional protection they can get. And if we say it's okay for the prosecutors to play fast and loose with Harvey Weinstein because he's rich and powerful and so many women hate him, who that actually hurts long-term is all of the other people that get brought in before these courts, before these judges who don't have the same resources and who might be innocent. That is simply no way to conduct an actual justice system. And I think this is where the Me Too movement went so wrong. I clearly agree with many of the tenets of the Me Too movement. I clearly, as a woman, have experienced sexual harassment and many of the other things people complained about under that umbrella. I also think victims of sexual assault need to get a lot more attention and resources in our criminal justice system. I think this is a huge issue that impacts society at large, and there needs to be better accountability. But I can agree with them on those things while still thinking Harvey Weinstein's conviction was kind of bullshit. And I said this during the Me Too movement as well. I thought it very quickly got out of hand. And I want to say something to you for the record, because I think this matters. You know, I'm pretty nonpartisan. I often find that people assume people on the left are like in lockstep with the Me Too movement. But I was doing criminal justice reform during the time this happened, and I worked with a lot of left-wing people who also opposed this movement and its aims. They were very short-sighted. A lot of them, you could tell, had never worked around criminal justice in their lives. This is a problem I often see when you have people all of a sudden get active on an issue that is pertaining to politics without doing the real work of understanding what they're advocating for. They often have really good intentions, as I think many of the people in the Me Too movement did, but they don't know what they're doing. They haven't taken the time to actually understand the policies that they're advocating for and what the secondary effects might be. And so they end up advocating for really, really harmful things. And that was quite frustrating to watch during this time, because many of us working on the ground within criminal justice reform wanted the opposite of what they were asking for. We wanted better due process. Instead, what we saw with the Me Too movement was first and foremost a push to conflate all sexual crimes, which I just think is severely problematic. There is a difference in rape and sexual assault, in battery and sexual harassment. These things are not one and the same and should not be treated as such. The Me Too movement basically tried to erase these classifications and lump all of these kinds of sexual offenses under one umbrella. That's not a good idea legally, and it's not a good idea even to advance these conversations. A man giving you negative attention at your workplace who you're not into is not the same thing as somebody raping you. It could still be a problem. It could still be something we don't want to happen. But to conflate them, it really undermines the very serious harm that is done by some of these more offenses. And legally, they should not be equated. The Me Too movement also had this moniker of believe all women. And basically in saying that, what they were saying is take them at their word. You shouldn't have to prove what happened to you. There shouldn't have to be evidence. They just acted like they wanted to sidestep all of these legal barriers that were in their way. They didn't want to actually have to prove anything. And I think that that is completely counterintuitive to where we should be going to actually have a justice system. If you don't want to take my word for it, just look at the rates of wrongful conviction we already deal with without going down the pathway they were trying to take us. This is data from the Innocence Project, which if you're wealthy, I encourage you to donate to, because I think they do incredible work, and it's thanks to them that we know the majority of what we know about wrongful convictions. They say, extrapolating from the 281 known DNA exonerations in the U.S. since the late 1980s, a conservative estimate is that 1% of the U.S. prison population, approximately 20,000 people, are falsely convicted. They go on to note that since the late 1980s, there have been as many as 850 exonerations nationwide, according to the University of Michigan law professor Samuel Gross, a leading researcher in the field. Many of them float under the radar, Gross says, unlike the highly publicized DNA exonerations. If you ever want to dig further into that data, again, go check them out because that's like the tip of the iceberg when it comes to that particular issue. And I think a big reason for the fact that we have so many wrongful convictions is the fact that most people aren't getting trials anymore at all. The vast majority of cases, both at the state and federal level, are pled out these days. That means the prosecutor comes in and they say, you're going to be charged with X, Y, Z, but if you don't want to go through this whole thing where we have to actually prove our case, you don't want to have to do a trial and all that, that sounds awful for you. You could just take this plea deal where you agree that you're guilty, you agree that you did it, and then we give you this sentence, and it's going to be a reduced sentence than what we'd ask for if you went to trial. And since the vast majority of these people don't have resources to fight the government, they say yes, they fold. And according to my data, a conservative estimate seems to be that over 90% of cases that are pled out in guilty pleas. And honestly, these people are operating in their own best interest because we have further data that shows if you refuse to play ball and you say, no, I actually want a trial, I'm protected by that, I'm given my constitutional right to a trial, you get hit with something known as the trial penalty, where prosecutors then tend to add extra charges, they fight even harder against you, and most of the time they win. And that tends to result in that person getting even harsher sentences than they would have gotten if they'd taken the plea. So it's important to remember that even if somebody takes a guilty plea, it doesn't necessarily mean they're guilty. It just means that they're kind of giving up and the system is stacked against them. On top of that, as I've mentioned several times in this episode, but I will continue to reiterate, the vast majority of people that are being prosecuted are poor. According to the American Action Forum, the United States currently incarcerates 2.2 million people, nearly half of whom are nonviolent drug offenders, accused people held pre-trial because they cannot afford their bail, and others who have been arrested for failure to pay debts or fines for minor infractions. Poverty and excessive legal punishments contribute significantly to the United States' high rate of imprisonment, which has disproportionately affected low-income and minority populations. So overall, you have a very, very powerful system versus the individual, and many of our constitutional provisions that were supposed to protect those individuals in these situations have been shredded. It is already so easy for police to get a warrant with basically no evidence whatsoever. The Fourth Amendment is basically gone ever since George W. Bush, and it just gets worse and worse every single year. Prosecutors are working hand in hand with police, and the majority of judges are former prosecutors themselves. So the only person actually maybe even trying to give the defendant a fair shake in the courtroom is their attorney. Jurors are often prohibited from being told vital information that could sway them when it comes to who they might convict or not, including the presence of something called jury nullification, which basically says if you believe a law is unconstitutional, even if the prosecutor proves their case, you can vote against them. But they prohibit jurors from being told about that. They often prevent anybody who has any knowledge of the criminal justice system from even sitting on a jury in the first place. They would never let me 10 feet near a jury. I would love to serve on a jury. It's my dream. It will never happen for me. Never. On top of that, you have the media without even the slightest semblance of nuance when it comes to these issues. They literally just regurgitate whatever police and prosecutors tell them. And then you have all of these really bad laws that have been passed by people in Congress and state legislatures, like mandatory minimums, very stringent sentences, and you don't even have a trial anymore, and you don't have the money to pay for one even if you got one. So all that to say, Harvey Weinstein's trial is what we call an outlier. Prosecutors are not used to having to actually prove their cases. They're not used to actually having to conduct a real trial with witnesses and evidence. And they're not used to having a defendant that has money to fight back. Prosecutors should have to prove their cases. This is just so basic, so common sense. This shouldn't be controversial at all. If laws need to change or catch up in order for that to happen, then good. You live in a republic. You have the ability to petition lawmakers to act on your behalf and change the laws. And by the way, we already have seen some of that as a result of the Me Too movement. We've seen some good things come out of it. Cultural pressure does work. You can still get things done politically by applying it. It just takes a little time. I would be in favor of things like expanding the statute of limitations on these crimes, removing barriers that make it more difficult to get a civil proceeding against people who have harmed you in this way. And we've seen some good bills being passed along those lines. President Trump signed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. Its changes included denying tax deductions for settlements subject to non-disclosure agreements in connection with sexual harassment or sexual abuse, which obviously help to discourage non-disparagement or agreements in connection with workplace sexual harassment. That's something we've seen employed by many businesses, and also, by the way, a lot in Congress to cover the tracks of the bad guys. On March 3rd, 2022, President Biden signed into law a bill amending the Federal Arbitration Act, when basically this says pre-dispute arbitration agreements are now barred for claims alleging sexual assault or sexual harassment. And I'm sure there's still other things that could be done, but what we don't want prosecutors doing is bending the existing rules and taking shortcuts and further undermining constitutional protections for defendants in order to get the outcomes that we want to see happen. There are better ways to stand up for victims of sexual violence than that. All that happens when they do this is other people get hurt. Victims of crimes need finality. Having a conviction overturned and thrown out would be absolutely devastating, and it would keep you from actually being able to have closure and begin to heal and move forward with your life. Convictions also need to be believable. They need to carry some weight. If you want the American people to actually trust its justice system, to actually abide by the rule of law, then there needs to be actual accountability and transparency and fairness. And when those things are removed, so too is the trust that the American people have in the system. And that ultimately just hurts victims because it makes them less likely to come forward. It makes them ultimately less likely to be believed, and it makes it much harder for them to get justice in the long run. Harvey Weinstein's prosecutors played fast and loose with the rules in this case because they were desperate to get the outcome that this conviction would bring for them. Obviously, this was a very high-profile case. They wanted to be able to say that they landed it, and we often see this with prosecutors when it comes to high-profile cases. Don't forget that these people are elected, they have donors, they want to get their name in the news in these kinds of circumstances. Unfortunately, in the Harvey Weinstein case, because most of the victims came forward so many years later, and because many of these cases were very, very messy, where many of them had agreed consensually to participate in sexual acts with him, it made it really difficult to actually prosecute him. And probably what should have happened is that this was dealt with civilly. These accounts are horrible. He should be disgraced. He should be shamed and never accepted into polite society again. We need to change the culture and ensure these things do not continue to happen. But it mostly was a learning lesson, more so than it was a time to prosecute. And this is a hard lesson for people, but it's an important one. The government cannot fix every problem. The criminal justice system is not the answer for every ill in society. In fact, the vast majority of them, it's just not. When there actually is an act of violence that has occurred against a person, it's very important for them to come forward quickly. And when they do, they need to cooperate and work with police. The reality is, most won't. These are tough cases to prove. It often is he said, she said. There's not a ton of evidence. So being able to quickly ascertain what's happened, to get credible statements from people who have been harmed, to gather any actual evidence that there might be, to interview people swiftly. These are really, really important if we want police and prosecutors to be able to bring charges in these circumstances. That requires victims changing the way they behave in many of these circumstances. And then on the other hand, we do need to apply more pressure to police and to prosecutors. Police need pressure to actually test freaking rape kits, to pursue charges against people when there are accounts of them harming others. And prosecutors need pressure to move forward with those charges when they are substantial. For the record, while we have done a lot of work to put pressure on police to start testing rape kits, my data shows across 30 states and Washington, D.C., USA Facts found at least 25,000 kits that still need testing as of 2022. That's inexcusable, especially when there are statutes of limitations on most of these cases. But this is where the murkiness of the Me Too movement actually really muddied the waters. While I would stand by Weinstein actually being charged for rape and sexual assault, the reality is that the vast majority of women who came forward against him were not saying that. Instead, they were saying he sexually harassed them, he blackmailed them, he intimidated him. These are actual criminal offenses, but you again have to have the evidence to show that they happened. The criminal definition of harassment is behavior patterns that bother, threaten, intimidate, alarm, or place people in fear of their safety. Harassment is unwelcome, uninvited behavior that degrades, threatens, or offends the victim, creating a hostile environment. So if that's what Harvey Weinstein was doing to people, they could have brought different charges, not necessarily sexually based charges, but different charges. That's not what they were trying to do. Instead, they were trying to put him on trial for sexual harassment. And in reality, it seems that for a large number of these women, at the very least, they were willing to play ball to an extent. Obviously, I have not had the time to comb through all of their various accounts or the data and evidence that they have, but it seemed to be a situation where many of these women had not rebuffed him, had not even turned him down, had maybe even had consensual relations with him, and then came to regret it, or in hindsight saw it as something where they were being pressured to do something they didn't want to do. That's a very important conversation for us to have, but it's not a criminal matter. It's not a criminal matter. Much of this discussion is actually a cultural problem or a civil problem at best. And I firmly think that those issues should remain under those domains. You're not going to talk me into expanding the criminal justice system any further. You're just not. It's already too big. I want to direct your attention to the Prison Policy Org's chart on just what our whole picture looks like in the U.S. for our incarceration nation, as I like to call it. So we have nearly 2 million people behind bars at any given time. The United States actually has the highest incarceration rate of any country in the world, and it is not particularly close. We spend about $182 billion every year, not to mention the significant social costs we pay as a result of that. And we lock up nearly 1% of our adult population. As you can see, this is split between various types of incarceration. State prisons actually hold the vast majority of people. Local jails are after them. And then you have federal prisons and jails after that. And then you have smaller populations over here, like immigration detention, involuntary commitment, and youth imprisonment. But it's a whole lot of people, and I would argue that a lot of them have no business being incarcerated. We are stealing people's freedom, we're stealing their lives for accusations that are not even what should be criminal in nature. If you rape someone, if you sexually assault them, I think you should go to jail. If you stalk them and harass them, I think you should go to jail. But if you display sexual advances that are unwelcome, I don't think you should go to jail if that's where it stops. If you're not actually taking it further than that and committing actual crimes, then you are a nuisance, you are a sexual pest, and maybe you should be culturally shamed. But that is a different matter than the criminal justice system should pertain to. And this is really, I think, why the prosecutors in the Weinstein case did play so fast and loose with their prosecution. Essentially, what got them in trouble is because their two defendants they were able to bring charges on behalf of didn't have that strong of stories. They tried to bring in a whole lot of other witnesses and have them tell their stories so they could establish, like, this is a pattern. This guy's a nuisance. He's annoying. And listen, these guys' stories are way worse than the actual two who are bringing charges here. So listen to them because you don't really want to look too deeply into these cases. And that's because both of the women who actually they could bring charges on behalf of had admitted to consensual sex with him in the past. Now, I want to be clear, just because you have had consensual sexual relations with somebody at one point does not mean that they are incapable of raping you at another point. What it does mean is that case becomes very, very difficult to prosecute. And that is just the reality of these types of crimes. It is simply going to be a lot harder to get a jury to believe that you had consensual sex with somebody at this point, and then later what they were doing was not welcome to you. I know that that is an outdated viewpoint, but again, that is not something government can fix. That is a cultural advancement that needs to happen to where people have a better understanding of sexual assault and rape. But because prosecutors really wanted to convict Harvey Weinstein, and because these were the only two cases they had the ability to bring charges in, they did that. They brought in all these extra witnesses, and basically they tried to put him on trial for his character, which you can't do and shouldn't be able to do. You need to be able to put people on trial for actual criminal acts, prove that they did it, and that's the only time they should go to jail. This is ultimately what got the prosecutors in trouble with the State Court of Appeals. In their 4-3 ruling, they said the trial judge made a critical mistake by letting women testify that Weinstein assaulted them, even though their accusations were not part of the charges he faced. The appeals court said the trial judge compounded the error by ruling that if Weinstein took the witness stand, prosecutors could question him on a wide range of, quote, loathsome conduct, including bullying and fits of anger towards associates. And so because of that, he didn't take the stand in his own defense, and now he's alleging that he didn't get that constitutional right to do so. And so ultimately, it got his case overturned. Now, again, I don't know the particular details about what these two women who were able to bring charges dealt with from Weinstein. What I do know and what I do want to speak to is my time working in the entertainment industry where these issues were very prevalent. Now, I didn't work in Hollywood where the majority of the Me Too issues tended to take place, but I did work in Nashville's music industry, and let me tell you, those issues were every bit as prevalent there. I moved to Nashville in 2007. I went to Belmont University, and I was a singer and songwriter during my time there while also interning on Music Row in various capacities. And what I found quite shocking as a somewhat naive, Southern Baptist minister's kid from the Deep South is that a lot of women, I would even go as far to say the majority of women who were getting record deals were getting them because they were sleeping with music executives. Sometimes they'd marry those music executives. Sometimes it was just hookups. It was pretty prevalent. I mean, really, just dig into the careers of Faith Hill and Shania Twain if you don't believe me. Most women who were really blowing up had husbands, had other men in their lives that had serious ties to the music industry and were able to catapult them. And because of that, there was a culture where a lot of women my age were sleeping with male executives and producers and songwriters and country artists trying to get their own deals. I personally was not willing to do that, was not willing to play ball, and that's one reason I left music and decided to do something else. But the reality is a lot of women did it. And because they did it, it made it really easy for men to then hit on people like me who were never going to do that. And it actually ends up hurting the careers of women who won't play ball. So I have a real issue with some of the women under these conversations where they went along with things like this from Harvey Weinstein. They used it to try to get ahead. They were willing to make a deal with the devil. And then when it didn't pan out for them, they turn around, they want to bring charges. It's one or the other. Either you are not okay with this kind of sexual harassment, like wink, wink, deal making, or you are when it benefits you. But you kind of have to pick one. I personally have it out for women that are okay with it because, again, the fact that you go along with it, the fact that you give into it makes me at more risk because then they think it's okay to display that same behavior towards me. Whereas if all women in lockstep were like, get lost, creep, absolutely not, get away from me, you dirty old man, they'd stop doing it. But again, none of these are criminal issues. They are societal problems. They are societal problems that do hurt women, especially in the workplace, but the government cannot solve them for you. There is a difference in being a creep and being a criminal, and the Me Too movement might be trying to erase that difference, but I am not. I think social shaming still works very, very well for the creeps, by the way. I'm not saying we do nothing about them, but it doesn't mean that you have grounds for conviction. Cheap convictions are not a step towards justice or even long-term societal change. We've seen rapists and sexual criminals being able to get away with it for decades. And so you've seen this overcorrection where now people want to come in and erase constitutional protections and just go after them and really get vengeance. But that's the wrong approach long-term. If Harvey Weinstein's going to be in jail, it needs to be for a solid conviction, and prosecutors need to actually prove their case based on the merits of the charges they have the ability to bring. All right, guys, that's a wrap for this week. Let me know your thoughts. I'm quite curious to see what you guys think about this one. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave me a like and a comment, and I'll see you next week. If you like this episode, don't forget to check out others in my series. Hannah Explains It All here, and you can watch my other weekly show, Histrionics, here.